Many Australians know the story of the Stinson, City of Brisbane, that took off from Archerfield Airport in Brisbane on the 19th of February 1937 on a route to Sydney via Lismore, but in severe weather crashed in the McPherson Ranges in Lamington National Park. And how a man called Bernard O'Reilly, on a hunch, went in search of the airliner after reading many falsely reported sightings, miraculously finding 2 survivors. And how an army of bushmen hacked their way 17 kilometres through thick jungle to bring the survivors out. But is there more to this story?
Well, I mean, the way the story goes, my grandfather, your uncle, was the ambulance superintendent in Kyogle, and he went there about 1934, 35, and opened the first ambulance station and then built it. But before that, he was a quite renowned bushman in his own right, and was a horse breaker as well as being involved in the timber industry, so he was very familiar with the bush. And in fact, one of the people he had contact with and got to know quite well was Bernard O'Reilly.
Yeah.
And my understanding from conversations I had with my grandfather and with my dad, who would have been 14, 15 years old at the time, was that when it went down, it got such publicity that they launched the search from the Queensland side, but also a group of people from the Kyogle or New South Wales side also went up, because that area where the plane came down was an area that a lot of people worked in for the timber industry. There's a lot of timber they got out at the time.
So once they were found, was he involved then in the extraction of them at all? Or?
My understanding is that when they got to the crash site, because they came from the other side, there was some involvement. And I understand that with regards to the extraction, given his ambulance background, I would imagine that his opinion and service would have, an important factor. In conversations with my grandfather, my understanding is that there were the initial deaths from the impact. However, there were serious injuries to a couple of the survivors, and part of the concern that my grandfather always has had post-event, and this was conveyed to me by conversations, was that in his opinion, in his qualified first aid opinion, a couple of the lives that were subsequently lost were potentials to have been rescued alive. That was where history comes into play.
Yeah, the history says that there was only two who survived the crash. Well, plus the third who was Westray.
Yeah, died in trying to find help. My understanding is that there was one who died immediately. But there was subsequently 2 of the deaths were possible survivors had they got to hospital quicker than what they did. Now, unfortunately, history is written by the victors. That's a well-proven and documented fact. And the story, as it was told to me by my grandfather, was that they wanted to take them down the opposite side of the ridge line, because it would have been quicker to access the railway line and get them on a litter on the railway and get them to hospital in Kyogle, which is New South Wales, then going back down the ridge through the forest to the road. And because the roads at the time were very rough and ready, we're talking what these days we would describe as a goat track, in very, very rough ambulance or vehicle transport with very poor suspension, causing more problems than it's possibly worth, to get them to the hospital in Beaudesert, or even if there was some sort of hospital in Rathdownie. But I think from memory that at that stage there was the main hospital was Beaudesert, So there was a time factor, there was a comfort factor for consideration, and whilst there was an argument to be had for the idea of taking them down to the rail line to get them to Kyogle Hospital, my understanding is that the officer in charge of police, I think Sergeant from the Queensland Police Force, pulled rank and said it happened in Queensland, they're going to a Queensland hospital, and he made the call that they would go back via the route that they subsequently took. And again, I'm only going on what I was told by my grandfather who was present. Lives could have been saved had they got to serious medical assistance quicker than what they did. But as I say, sadly, interstate rivalry was evident even back then. And the old New South Queensland divide, unfortunately, we will never know. We will never know. But as I say, I heard it from my grandfather who was there, who was involved, and given everything that man did in his life, I have no reason to doubt him whatsoever.
So this is a bit of a bigger, that's where the crash, that's the crash site there, which equates to about here on this map. And so the track follows up along this ridge line until they head down this way towards towards where they came out. Or if you follow this spur down this way, you'll head to just about, comes down here to Running Creek. The railway line is about 3 k's, and that's reasonably flat, and not that you can see it too clearly on this map, but when you zoom in on the computer screen, the slope down here, I reckon, is about half of what the slope this way is. So I'm really keen to walk this section and just to prove to myself how much easier that would have been.
But as I say, particularly when you become aware of the fact that there was an alternative suggested that was not even considered, then it beggars a question: why not? Mind you, when you do this, you may be surprised at the relative ease comparatively. And that'll be a very interesting fact. Just to get your opinion from this identified point to there. What is the comparison time-wise? It's going to be an interesting call. But time will tell. All I can say, good luck.
Thanks. My plan was to start at the Christmas Creek camping area where I leave my car, head down along Christmas Creek Road to the beginning of the National Park, follow the river up to West Ray's grave, then I'll commence the steep incline up towards the Stinson wreck. Once at the wreck, I'll camp there for the night. The next day, heading out along the stretcher track, the way they brought the survivors out to safety. In part 2, I'll try and find my way down the New South Wales side of the range to the railway, along the path that my great uncle said he and Bernard O'Reilly originally wanted to take, and compare how much easier, if any, it would have been. And so I set off on this journey to trace the steps taken by the men who assisted in the rescue efforts of the Stinson passengers and crew, and to determine just how easy it would have been to take an alternate route down out of the range. Including the area over the New South Wales border, there are roughly 80,000 acres of unbroken trackless jungle on the McPherson range, in most of which visibility is limited to 10 metres by a tangle of tough green vines as dense as wire netting and covered with murderous thorns. O'Reilly was a true bushman. No GPS, no compass, not even a tent. Searching this jungle, he took with him an empty jam tin, 2 loaves of bread, 500 grams of butter, 6 onions, and tea and sugar. His first aid kit, some homemade snakebite antidote, a razor, and some string. When O'Reilly had found the wreck, the survivors were in a bad way. Home was 22 miles away across difficult country. Out of the mountains on the Queensland side, the settlements of Hillview, Lamington and Christmas Creek were relatively close. These would be his best bet in getting help, but a way had to be found out to them, and more importantly still, a way found back in. O'Reilly continued, almost running along the track to get help. As night fell and darkness crept in, he had nothing to guide him but the grey reflection on the water of the river, and so that's exactly what he used, walking through the river itself. He had no sooner made it back to civilization than he was heading back up this same path again, with a doctor and a small rescue party, but carrying stretchers, they would need another way out. A man called John Buchanan was to take every man that could be mustered up an open forest ridge onto the low end of Lamington Plateau, and at dawn commence cutting a track up the gradually sloping backbone of the range to the wreck. One of the survivors, Jim Westray, a brilliant young Englishman on a business trip to Australia, had decided the morning after the crash to head out in search of help. O'Reilly had followed the Englishman's tracks through the difficult terrain, down almost perpendicular slopes of loose earth, down to the river, to a waterfall where Westray had met his demise, using the Homolzia lilies to help himself climb down the waterfall, only to find there is nothing more brittle or treacherous than those safe-looking footholds. Jim Westray had continued crawling on his hands and knees for miles down the river and around 4 more waterfalls before succumbing to his death, where he was found by Bernard O'Reilly and has now been laid to rest. So, made it to Westray's grave, and now we've got the trek up the hill, the crazy steep trek up the hill to get to the wreck and the campground. Alright, so here we are, the climb. It looks hell steep from here. I don't know, the camera never does it justice, but there's no way you're going to really appreciate how steep that is without actually being here. So we've got a sign here at the bottom. It says 600 meters elevation up from here. Really hard. Bring water. Turn back. So yeah, that's the track up. I made it to camp. It's 20 to 4 now. That was one hell of a walk, so I thought it was just going to be a slight rise, but tell you what, carrying that heavy backpack, even that last bit, just absolutely killed me. Anyway, we're here now. It's quite a small little campground. There's up that way is the stretcher track where we'll be heading out tomorrow, and down this way is the actual plane wreck. So we'll go and check that out in a second, I think. But yeah, so glad to be here. So glad to have finally made it. Means I can stop walking. Man, I'm gonna eat big tonight, and yeah, the pack will be a little bit lighter to head out tomorrow. What a walk. That was just mammoth. Here it is. This is where it crashed. There's a plaque here. dedicated to the memory of Captain Reginald Rex Boyden, Flying Officer Beverly Shepherd, James Roland Graham, William Walden Fountain, who died in the crash of the Stinson airliner VH-UHH, City of Brisbane, on the 19th of February 1937. Here's a piece of the wreckage. This plaque marks the spot where Stinson airliner VH-UHH, City of Brisbane, crashed on the 19th of February 1937, and where 2 survivors sat for 10 days until found by Bernard O'Reilly. We remember the Stinson, a pathfinder at the dawn of commercial aviation in Australia. That was it's quite a steep walk down here from the campsite, and to think that they carried men on stretchers up this to get them out to safety, just incredible. Here I am, leaving my pack up the top because it's too heavy. Again, you never really get an appreciation for the steepness in camera, I know. But some parts pretty wild, and also slippery.
It was suggested in some circles that the pilot was flying too low, but if you trace the course from where it was last seen to where it crashed, you'll find it crossed 2 ranges, both higher than where the crash had occurred. Now, Boyden was no amateur. He learned his flying in the hardest of schools, the Great War, and the men that went up in those flimsy crates and faced von Richthofen's guns were not wanting in either courage or skill. The more likely answer is the plane was forced down by a downdraft. He lost his plane and his life battling with Queensland's oldest and greatest enemy, the cyclone.
Right, all packed up, ready to head out. It's about 20 k's, hopefully not as hilly as yesterday. So yeah, hope to be back around, well, definitely by 4, but hopefully by around 2. But the track out of here is a lot harder to navigate than the one in. So the one in's been well traipsed, people, hiking groups coming up here all the time. But this one out apparently disappears in places. So, and for reference, off to the western side here, down a little track, there's a running creek probably about 500 metres, 400 metres away. So I was able to top up the water supply. So should have plenty to get me through today. Anyway, let's get a move on. Right, so I've met the junction here where up that way is meant to be the lookout, but I've followed that up and there's not a lookout that I can see, just a little clearing where some people have camped before. And out this way is where we follow the ridge line along the stretcher track where they carried out the people from the wreck. So should be easy going, I'm hoping. From here we're just following the ridge line along, no more climbing. Maybe a little bit here and there, but anyway,
let's get a move on.
While the doctor and a few men set about tending to the survivors, others in the party had made a start to cut the track back along this range top to meet John Buchanan's cutting party. Now, lack of visibility in a crescent-shaped creek gorge threw O'Reilly's men out of their reckoning, but contact was made with the other party about sunset. By the time they met, they'd looked like men who had done 5 days' work without resting, and that was about right too. They had done 5 days' work in one. They had worked with the savage desperation of miners whose mates are entombed. They had worked for a cause, the divine spark which turns men into supermen. My progress along the plateau was very slow. You can't travel quickly through this mess of vines when the track continues to fade out and without a machete to clear the way. At this stage too, weariness was beginning to overtake me. The trip had not just been a matter of walking and scrambling over rough country. I was carrying a heavy pack and battling overgrown jungle. It had been a battle as tiring as if I'd been forcing my way through knee-deep rough surf.
Just thick, overgrown. The track goes missing constantly. Heading back uphill now. Tell you what, without a GPS, I would be lost. The track just disappears all over the place. I don't know when it'll eventually open out, but it's just thick rainforest. It's beautiful though. It's just hard yakka. Anyway, keep moving.
As I got closer to the end, the track became slightly more discernible. My spirits of actually making progress began to rise.
Well, we're on the last little bit now, so the terrain has opened up. We've just got a lot of the grass trees around. I'm just heading down the spur of this mountain.
It did make me wonder though how these men managed to do this. How O'Reilly managed in worse terrain than this and on his own with no equipment. O'Reilly navigated using his own reckoning and knowledge of nature in the area. He knew that the ranges ran south to north. He knew that if he cut them at right angles he'd be heading east to west. His map showed ridges and gorges, so he just marked them off as he came to them. He also knew all the other signs the jungle gave to make the points of the compass. Northern and eastern slopes are always matted with the heaviest growths of loya and raspberry vine, while southern slopes give way to forests of fern trees and great clusters of lilies. Also, the southern side of a tree is heavily covered with lichen and moss, while the northern side shows a smooth bowl. He could estimate his altitude accurately by the plant growth. Down in the lower jungles at the foot of the ranges, a certain species of tree will bloom 6 weeks earlier than the same species at the loftiest heights. At the lower levels, the tree will be going to seed, while at 2,000 feet it will be blooming, and at 4,000 feet it will be an early bud. Since altitudes marked on the map, this also helped him locate his position. The same sliding scale applies to nesting birds. The prevailing winds in the McPhersons are from the south, so all the trees in exposed places have a heavy lean to the north. Nature is willing and anxious to help, if only you'll take the trouble to notice. Carrying the stretchers out, they did not stop to rest once. When a man tired, another took his place. The cavalcade just kept moving. As they came down the final climb, the front stretcher bearers held their bars above their heads, the ones at the back with the bars below their knees, so that the sick men could be kept on an even keel. At one point, where the mountain broke away sharply, a stout rope was used to put around the entire stretcher party and anchored to another group of men who steadied them down the decline. 11 hours after that dawn beginning, the men were down.
What a climb down that was. Far out. It's now 4:10, and man, there is no way they could have carried stretchers down there, I reckon. Oh, that was incredible. So steep. Holes in the ground everywhere. Loose ground, slipping, tripping, falling. Oh man, I must have picked myself up 15 times. Yeah, that was full on. But anyway, we're as good as made it out now. Just the last little bit of road down to the car, and I'm out. This has been an epic journey, absolutely epic. I've never done a hike this hard before in my life. So I'm really keen to go down on the other side of that mountain next time and see what that's like compared to this side, because man, was that hard. Anyway, time to head back to the car.